Good morning. I hope you had a great weekend, and we're off to the races, continuing our little excursus on suffering. It's Philippians chapter 1, verse 29. For you it has been granted for Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer. And so at the end of last week, I said, look, we need, first of all, to expect suffering. This is a broken world. It's riddled with sin. We are seeing the effects of it. And so there is a lot of pain. There is injustice. There is suffering. There are things that are going wrong. We should not be surprised. Jesus suffered. The disciples suffered. We're told to expect suffering. Secondly, it doesn't mean that we're doing something wrong. Just because we suffer doesn't mean we are being punished. Perhaps, and by and large, we often suffer the result of bad decisions and sin. Sin is self-destructive behavior. God doesn't zap us because we cross certain lines. He's trying to tell us how things work, and when we violate the laws that ultimately flow out of his character, there's consequences. And so maybe we are suffering because of bad things that we've done, but not necessarily. Job wasn't suffering because of evil that he had done. Third, I said there's opportunity here to grow. Suffering is not good in and of itself, but it does bring an opportunity for us to become better, to have rough edges rounded, to become more Christ-like, to have more empathy, to be more humble. So 3 additional points today. One, I want you to know that we don't suffer the way we should. If you read through the Old Testament, you read the book of Psalms, you read Elijah and Jeremiah, you read Isaiah, you read the prophets, you find that they're often marveling that God doesn't sort of judge us more harshly. They marvel at his patience. They marvel at how long-suffering he is. And so, look, we can't see ourselves very accurately, but we're broken, we're sinful, we're self-oriented, we've got pride issues, we've got a lot of things that honestly, before a holy, righteous God, we should be suffering. But God is patient and gracious, and so we don't suffer as we should. 5th point is that our suffering is temporary. And we need to always remind ourselves of this. Right? These are light and momentary afflictions, Paul writes, producing for us an eternal weight of glory. And we need to shine our headlights beyond the grave into heaven. We need to realize that a whole lot of the trials that we face can actually be preparing for a greater future, especially when we bring suffering upon ourselves, which is sort of what you think of with discipline, when we sacrifice, when we give, when we bear someone else's burdens. Those are all forms of suffering. Those are all disciplines of the Christian life. And they actually position us for more reward, and our suffering is fleeting. Finally, we do not have a high priest who cannot relate to us. Jesus showed up and suffered more than we will ever suffer. God understands our situation. He became one of us. And so God was not above it. He bore our pain so that we don't ultimately bear it. I had a chance 10 years ago or so. I was at an event. John Stott was speaking. He was interviewed. He had just turned 80. He asked him if he had any regrets. Obviously, a very accomplished guy, had done a whole lot of things, a whale of amount of good. He said, do you have regrets? And he said, I do regret that I was not given the privilege of suffering for my Savior. Now, we don't want to suffer because of the foolish decisions that we made. And oftentimes Christians think they're suffering for righteousness, and they're just being short-sighted and blind and self-oriented. But to suffer for Christ is a privilege. And so Paul writes to the Philippians, and he says, you are getting a privilege. Right? You are getting the privilege of suffering. Let's let suffering, the trials, the hardships that we face, help us to become more like Jesus. Have a good day.